of Allahabad. We'll be speaking on perception, action, interactions, hierarchical control, and self-healing.
The workshop. This is going to be, I guess, a completely different talk from the previous one. So let's see how it goes. Let me get a couple of small philosophical things out of the way. I'm going to talk about the self. So, and one of the interesting things about self or for the matter consciousness is that all of you have phenomenological data about yourself. So whatever I'm going to say, I'm sure you're going to think about it in the context of whatever your phenomenology is. So keep that in mind. It's a little bit different from the other talks. So couple of things. There are all kinds of views about self. I will get a couple of views slightly out of the way. At least I'm not going to talk about it, but if you want to talk philosophy, maybe we can talk separately. One is there are, of course, views of self as something as transcendent, both in India and elsewhere. I'm not going to talk about that at all. So the second thing is there are many people who think self is an illusion. So I'm not really going to say because it depends on what you mean by self as well when you say self is an illusion. So again, I'm not going to talk about that as well. So the effort is not to worry about either of those two positions, but try to naturalize self in terms of trying to understand it in as better way as possible. The methodology mostly is psychophysics, so I'm a psychologist. So there is going to be very little about brain, maybe a little bit, so keep that in mind. Okay, let me start with this silly, simple picture. Presumably this is organism. The organism perceives, cognizes, and performs actions. Of course, it makes changes in the environment, and then various environmental events occur, and then presumably this goes on and on. Okay? And of course, we should not also forget that there are other agents in the picture. So those other agents also cause changes in the environment. You are not the only one changing things. There are others who are changing things as well. And of course, you can perceive them, you can think about them as well. So just keep this simple thing in mind. And of course, you can do it. Now, when you start talking about perception and action, one of the things that happens for the most part, and Susan Hurley has referred to it as the classic sandwich model, simply because it looks like a sandwich. You have perception, you have cognition, this is something that happens in eating the bread, I guess, and then action. Okay? A lot of research is driven by this. Whether it's neuroscience, whether it's psychology, it doesn't matter. Predominantly, it's driven by the fact that you are on the one end, you have perception, on the other end, you have action. They are separate from each other, and they are peripheral. And then there is something in between, lies cognition. Of course, it can differ in terms of different organisms. So you can ask various questions about it. I'm not really going to answer all of them, but I just put it up. So one question is, for example, is cognitive processing really central and distinct from sensory motor processing? Is there something called cognition that is different from sensory motor processing? Are perception and action really peripheral and separate from one another? Can we actually make a claim that perception and action are separate? Okay, just to give a particular point of view, in visual perception and action, there is the two systems view by Milner and Goodale. So you have two visual pathways or two systems. You have the ventral system and you have the dorsal system. Presumably the ventral system is for perception, the dorsal system is for action. At least that's the standard Milner and Goodale. However, there have been a lot of people arguing against this separation of perception and action. An example would be James Gibson, who always argued that perception and action are tightly coupled. You actually cannot separate one from the other. So you can think in terms of somehow cognition emerges out of interaction between perception and action. Bernard Hammel has talked about the fact that perception and action actually share common resources in the context of his theory of event coding. So the questions you can ask is that how is the perceived event, whatever you are perceiving, influenced by how loose or tight the coupling between perception and action is? One way is you can call it binding as well. Remember, I'm not talking about binding of different visual features, which is one way to talk about binding. So the question is, how do you couple these two, or how can you talk about them? I will just give examples. You can also ask, let me introduce a term here, does an intention influence what we perceive? So it could be a goal, it could be, it's typically a perceptual goal, that when we do perform an action, we just don't perform an action, we have some perceptual effect that we want to cause in the world, something that we want to experience. We perform an action, we perceive something, maybe if it is not the same as what we thought, we may do some other action, change our actions, and this goes on and on. Okay? Even if you can think of a simple experiment, there is always intention. That is, at least in the context of humans, we can reasonably talk about it. So, for example, I will arbitrarily pick an example. Yesterday we talked about a simple experiment in the context of touching with a finger. Right? So now the question is, where does intention come in? Maybe somebody can make a guess. I mean, the task is to press, if I remember correctly, this touch. It's actually in the instructions. You give the instructions to the subject, so you actually create the intention in the context of the experiment through that. You already, whatever instructions you are going to give is going to be in terms of the perceptual effect that you want the subject to produce or to see. So press very hard. Okay, how do you know that the subject has to experience some kind of hardness? Okay, so that's the effect, perceptual effect, that could be an intention in the context of an experiment, defined by an experimenter, but in real life it could be a number of things. Okay, so here is a small example. We'll start here and we'll eventually reach self quickly. The theory of event coding at least suggests that there is common coding between perception and action. I'm just going to go through one simple experiment very quickly. This is done by Bernard Hammel. You ask subjects first to think of raising the left hand or the right hand. So they think about it, and then it's followed by, so you first think about a hand, and then it's followed by an arrow, and then you have to say whether the arrow is pointed to the left or to the right. So there are two things to do. One is you need to think of something. Now, of course, you can indicate whether you thought of left or right after. You can press a key or something. So the point, what you showed was, excuse me, the reaction time is greater when actually you think of the right hand, raising the right hand, and if the arrow is pointing to the right, you are actually slower to respond to the arrow compared to when it's the other way around. So presumably you imagine something and then you have to make a response. They share the same representations, then there is some kind of a conflict. You actually end up taking more time. Okay, here is another example. This is slightly different. This is comes from Dennis Profit and his colleagues. And many have argued that perception is actually closely linked to action planning. So for example, I mean, Scott Jordan in his paper actually says to see is to simultaneously plan. Okay, so you can't really separate the two. So for example, this was done at University of Virginia. This simply had lots of slopes. I've not seen it. But essentially, the task is to estimate the perceptual slant of this small hill. Now, there are multiple ways you can ask people to estimate the slant. You can get a verbal measure. You can also come with a visual measure of slant. But when you do it, people tend to overestimate the slant. Okay? However, you actually give this device. The participant is now, of course, close their eye. They are not supposed to look at this at all. So they are using haptics they can just, all they have is feedback from their hands. They can adjust the slant of the small wooden thing here, and then what they do, they actually come up with accurate estimates of slant when they do it that way. But if you ask them to produce a visual measure, they are seeing, so the perceptual modality is still the same in terms of they are seeing the slant, but if they have to produce a visual measure, something like a protractor, give them an arrow and they have to change, then they actually overestimate. Okay? So now in this case, the modality of response, the reporting in some sense is what changes, but what differs is their perceptual estimate. They actually come up with different estimates. He also did another study where he made people run around a lot, so he actually fatigued them in some sense, they are tired. Then again, you ask them to estimate just a visual measure. Now they don't have to, please remember though, they don't actually have to climb up the hill or anything like that. Okay, so they're just making a visual estimate of the slant. So they end up overestimating even more. It's almost as though they are, if I go up the hill, I'm already tired, I can't do it. So essentially, perception is tightly linked, seems to be linked to action planning, in case, I guess, as though they would climb up the hill. Okay. So the point to get away from the sandwich model, in which you show a stimulus and people perceive it, make a response, you change it slightly. So in these studies, it's a little bit different. So I just termed it as intention, action, perception. There is, of course, another action here. They have to still respond to tell us what they perceive. So initially, they start with an intention. You start with that. You perform an action. You produce a perceptual effect. So it's a little bit different from standard studies that you may have seen. So this, of course, actually comes from the Wundt's lab, the clock device that he used, but variations of that have been used. Let me just quickly go through. This is a famous experiment by Benjamin Libet. Let me just introduce the methodology. It's controversial. I'm not going to discuss the controversies, but essentially what Benjamin Libet gave was a clock. People, they were told that as soon as they get an intention to press a key, they should note down at what, the clock arrow is moving along, and they are supposed to note down the time. Okay? So essentially this is timing of intention. So here is, now he measured EEG, so he measured readiness potentials, and then presumably the point is readiness potential precedes awareness of the intention to act, so it's the starting point. So what happened was the awareness of intention to act happened here roughly 200 milliseconds before they actually pressed the key in terms of the timing. However, the readiness potential had already started 550 milliseconds before they actually pressed the key. Now, there are multiple implications for this. One implication, of course, this is a code. The process leading to a voluntary act is initiated by the brain unconsciously well before, some 350 to 400 milliseconds, the conscious will to act appears. Free will would not initiate a voluntary act. Okay, so the argument is there is really no free will to actually, there are some unconscious processes that have already started the action and awareness occurs much later. Okay. Now, of course, then the question is, what does it mean for self? Is it epiphenomenal that we have? We do have this feeling that we have a self, that we perform actions, we voluntarily choose to perform. Presumably all of you voluntarily have come to attend this conference, voluntarily decided to listen or not listen to the talks. So the question is it epiphenomenal, that the feeling that you have? Is there some role, this whatever feeling of experience or agency that we have, is there some functional role for it? Or is it just a byproduct of various unconscious, presumably cognitive processes? Okay? So one argument that has been put forward, let me introduce it as well, is that given the fact that the awareness of intention presumably occurs 200 milliseconds before the action per se, that at least it gives you 200 milliseconds to veto, to stop the action. So, so maybe you can't do anything with fear, but at least you can stop actions, presumably. That awareness would help you. Okay, so how do we take it forward? This is a simple experiment from Haddad, Patrick Haddad and his colleagues. Again, you start with a clock face type of thing, so there is an arrow that is moving around, and then subjects are asked to perform a voluntary key press. Then it would produce an effect, let's say a tone, and then of course people have to give where the clock face was when they had actually the intention to press the key, okay, or when they press the key, could be both. So the finding is that, and let me just skip it and move along, is that the main finding is that the time between the key press and the effect, between the action and the perceptual effect that follows it, was shorter when people actually thought that they pressed it voluntarily. So they actually have conditions of voluntary actions, involuntary actions. They actually had a TMS conditions as well to produce an action involuntarily. So when it was voluntary, the time between, so they called it intentional binding, that the action and the perception that follows it seems to be closer in time, to be coupled to each other if this was voluntary action. Okay? So presumably they think that it is somehow linked to the kind of sense of agency that we have. Okay, one issue is related to control. So Moore and others actually manipulated the probabilistic relationship between the action and the effect that follows, in this case the tone. So you can actually manipulate the probability. So for example, you can manipulate the probability that the tone will occur if the action was performed, probability that the tone will occur if the action was not performed. You can take the difference that they would call contingency. And they showed that the intentional binding changed as a function of contingency. So it seemed to be sensitive to probability information. Okay? So one argument is that this kind of intentional binding can be used as an implicit measure of sense of agency. The fact that somehow they seem to be bound together with action and perception. And others have shown that the degree of binding increases with increase in control that you can give in terms of performing the action. Okay, a slightly different kind of an effect. You can actually show that control also changes other kinds of perceptual experience. I don't know how many of you have seen the flashback effect, so let me just play it if you have not seen it. I really do not know. If it's a repetition, just bear with me. Essentially, you fixate at the center, and then there will be a white square that will move around. There will be roughly a red square that will come here, and you are supposed to report that when the red square comes, where the white square is. Is that task clear? I'm going to ask you to do it, by the way. Please do it. Okay? So, can you play the key? So the white square will move around. So when the red one came, where was the white square? If you want to do it, I can play that. Somebody please? Maybe again? Okay, roughly here. Am I correct? Of course it's an illusion. Actually, I have another video, probably I didn't copy it, but when the red comes here, the white square was actually exactly in line with it. Okay? So that's why it's called the flashback.
You were right.
Well, it's okay. The thing is, you can do many trials and change the lag. The effect magnitude is different for different people slightly, so that's fine. The effect will be even more larger if you actually fixate at the center, okay, and not move your eyes along with it. So you can then get an even better magnitude. Now, The point is that if I actually give you control to move this white square, then right now it's moving passively, right? You are a passive observer. But I make you an active observer and I actually give you control of the movement here, the illusion magnitude changes, your experience changes. So the fact that you are performing an action here changes what you perceive. Okay? Is that clear? Unfortunately, I don't have a control version of it to show. That would need some display where you can actually control the movement. But just believe me. Okay. Now, people have done other kinds of tasks as well. This is like a board which you are supposed to control, a virtual board in the computer. And then you can have different amounts of control, and you have a goal as well. You are supposed to reach a particular point. Think of it like a small game, and you are supposed to navigate a virtual board in a noisy environment, and you are supposed to reach a goal point, and people were asked questions about their judgment of control. Okay? And what the finding is that somehow even when the environment noise led them closer to the goal, actually they had fairly poor control, but the fact is that if the environment noise led them closer to the goal, they actually reported greater control. Okay? Just keep this in mind. We will slightly change the result as we go along. Does that make sense? So the point is that there seems to be something here. Okay, so the question is, how do we proceed? I'm going to present what is called an event control approach or event control hierarchy. This is a bit of a cartoon, so it's not really a serious model of any kind, but hopefully it makes some sense. Oops. Yeah. Is it a video? No. Okay, okay, that's fine. Probably next one. Okay, here is the way you can think about it. One of the ways we think about it, think of a neural network. We have input layer, hidden layer, output layer. So you think of each layer as modular, right? So maybe the first layer you can think of perception, the hidden layer may be cognition, and the last layer is maybe related to response. Okay, to put it very simply. So you cut it this way, in some sense there is a modular architecture. Probably that's not the right way to look at it. At least that's one possible opinion. So you rather look at it in terms of perception action loops, but that are hierarchically organized in different spatial and temporal scales. Okay, so actually speaking, there are various perception action loops. Presumably this represents them. And the change here is that as you go from this direction to this direction, both the perception and the action, we would call it an event, coupled perception action as an event, is proximal, both in terms of space and time. As you go up in the hierarchy, it will become more and more distal. Okay? So just to keep in terms of the sensory modality, touch will be more proximal, vision will be more distal, in terms of the events you see as well as events you control. Maybe it's cloudy, I may do something, I may take an umbrella. I mean, this has nothing to do with anything direct, neither a stimulus nor a response. Okay? So it's fairly distal, or you can plan to get a PhD 5 years from now. That's a very distal event. And then, so that would be somewhere here. So intentions, a lot of time will occur somewhere here. Attention as control processes will occur somewhere here because attentional processes, for example, in perception change fairly quickly. You have fairly fast attentional processes. So that will be more proximal. And intention will probably, relatively speaking, occur at more distal because your goals will tend to be more distal. Okay, so in the context of event binding and control, the degree of binding between each level can quantify in terms of the amount of control you can exercise at that level. Okay, so each level presumably you can exercise some amount of control, and that presumably would determine the degree of binding. And for each level, will differ in terms of spatio-temporal distance. There is also a hierarchical relationship. Some people have called it something like a nested hierarchy. I'm not a mathematician, but I will just leave it there. So one issue is that the control exercised at a higher level probably would depend on control exercised at lower levels. Okay? And not vice versa. So Okay, so the question is that I still have to see how it relates to self. I'll come to it. So the control itself will depend on two parts. One, there are prior predictions of the system that influences the action part, but there is also post-event analysis of environmental information. You have produced a change in the environment, you perceive it, and that of course is the perception part of the event. So in the hierarchy, the post-event information travels bottom up, but simultaneously the predictions travel top down. So prior predictions of the proximal level in hierarchy depends on information from the higher level. So it actually postulates how information travels between different levels in the hierarchy. Okay, so something like this, I mean this is just a concept. But the point here is that the sense of agency now, or self, the way you feel about yourself, would depend on the highest level at which control is being exercised, that you can successfully exercise control. Okay? So let me quickly, this is just a simple example. I don't know whether it would make sense. Here is a musician. Okay, so a beginning pianist, if you are trying to learn, you have a stronger sense of self essentially attached to the kind of movements you make your hand. Did I press the right finger? Or if you are a driver, what gear that I am changing to, etc., etc. You are constantly thinking about proximal perceptions and actions that you have to make so that in this case you can produce music. Of course, as with practice, what's going to happen? So presumably is an expert, then you are actually thinking more in terms of the melody or the tune that you are producing. You are not really thinking in terms of control, in terms of did I press the right finger, or yourself is not attached to it. You don't even think about it in any explicit sense. So essentially you can think of it as the sense of self is different for these two people, the beginner versus the expert. It's at different levels in the hierarchy. Okay, so essentially what we've done, I will quickly, we did two experiments. I'll go to the methodology quickly, actually, to see how we can use this to actually empirically do something about self. Let me skip this also. The one thing I did mention though, that we should not forget that there are other agents. We may produce an effect in the environment, but how do you know that we are the ones who produced it and nobody else did? Especially when other agents are present in the environment. Okay? So essentially the point we want to make is that essentially I am where control is, okay, in terms of the level in which the control is achieved. This is a psychophysics experiment. It's like a game. I'll show you the stimulus quickly. What you see are a bunch of circles. Let me use terminology here. The X is called a sheep. This is based on causality animacy studies. Okay, so the X is a sheep. The rest of them are wolves, in the way terminology we are going to use. Of course, they are differently colored right now. So the blue is the target sheep, presumably the task for the wolves, and these two are wolves. Actually, all are wolves, but the yellow ones are wolves, but they just move randomly. Okay, they don't do anything. They're just moving randomly. They are not trying to catch the sheep. The red ones are completely controlled by the computer. Okay, they just use a simple heat sink algorithm, see where the sheep is, with some variation and noise, directly try to go towards catching the sheep. Okay, and of course the green one in this case is the wolf that is controlled by the subject. So the subject has a joystick, the subject has to move this wolf, and the goal is of course trying to catch the sheep. Is that clear, the task? Okay, it's a fairly hard task, but it's a bit like a computer game. It's not a discrete trial in a normal way we do experiments. Now, let me go back to the method. So the chaser wolves use a particular algorithm. The non-chasers move in a random path. The sheep, of course, moves in a random path normally. However, if a wolf entered an imaginary circular parameter, obviously it will try to escape. So the sheep changed path to opposite direction of the wolf. Okay, so it's still trying to get away. Now, one wolf one of them is controlled by the participant, okay, by the joystick. The overall direction in which the subject controls the wolf is determined by an algorithm. It's a weighted average of, so which means even this is not fully under the subject's control. It's partially determined by the computer. So now you can actually vary the amount of control you over the joystick, which essentially means how the wolf you control moves, okay? And there are 5 levels of control. Is that clear? If it's not, please tell me. That's the method. Now, the thing is, all this different color coding is something that is for you. Okay? This is a trial. This is just a capture. So presumably in this case, the 5, which is you, have caught the sheep. Now, this is not what the subject sees, by the way, or will even experience. That will look like this. Actually, there is no different color coding here. The subject doesn't know which wolf he or she is controlling. Okay? So the task is actually 2 now. 1, you are supposed to catch the sheep. 2, you have no idea which wolf you are controlling. Okay? So you have to figure out by performing an action, the joystick, which wolf you are actually controlling, and simultaneously you have a goal, which is to catch the sheep. Is the task clear now? Okay. So it will look like this. I mean, this is again passive, pardon me. But, well, it's the same thing as before. But now, remember, sorry, the 2 computer generated ones are also fairly close here. They are also have the same goal, and they are almost, in this case, near. In fact, they may even catch it before you. It's not guaranteed. So none of it is programmed. So then whatever they are doing. Only the algorithm is fixed. Okay. So this is the procedure, now the task. And the task is, of course, the trial ends when any one of the wolves catch the sheep. So you don't know which wolf has caught the sheep. So you have a series of questions at the end of each trial. The first question is, which wolf are you controlling? You have to identify the one you are controlling. 2, how much do you identify with the wolf you have chosen? You have to give a rating between 0 to 8. How much do you think your actions affect the movement of the wolf that you think you control? Just a measure of, phenomenological measure of what rating you give. And how much do you think wolves in general affect the movement of the sheep? This is just to see that, we won't really look at this, but it's just there to see what they think of. Interestingly enough, this is not part of the data, but people who actually do the task will actually start using first person very quickly. This is me, I caught the sheep, okay? This is not part of the data I'm going to report. They will actually start using words, I caught the sheep, I didn't catch the sheep in this trial. They will not even say that circle caught the sheep, but that circle did not catch it anymore. Okay? This is phenomenology. I'm just telling you interesting. Anyway, the point is that one of the interesting things is if control is something to do with identification, and in this case, they actually have to identify. This is the identification task, that they have to identify self in some sense, or the object that they are controlling. So the question is that as control changes, then identification should also change, number 1. Number 2, they also have a goal of catching. So the goal doesn't matter, because perceptually, whether they catch the sheep or they don't catch the sheep, they have the same perception, action, experience, both cases, okay? Here is the result. I'm just going to show one because I think we are running out of time, but roughly they are all similar, so I will skip the ratings. First is that one possibility is they catch the sheep. Another possibility is they don't catch the sheep. So we plot the percentage of trials in which they accurately identify separately. When they catch the sheep, when they don't have any control, is very bad. But even if they have 1/4 of control, their identification percentage doesn't change as a function of the amount of control, which is in some sense continuous, going from 20% to 100%. Is that clear? If they catch. If they don't catch, the pattern is completely different. Now, actually, well, it's not necessarily linear, but it actually looks like a bit exponential. Now, actually, the amount of control does matter. So, when they did not catch the sheep, the actual amount of control which is proximal that they had over the joystick did matter. It affected performance. Whereas here it really didn't have any effect. Same thing roughly mirrors in the ratings with some slight differences. So the point here is that now you have two slightly different kinds of effects. One, control does matter, but the effect of control is not the same. When you manage to catch the sheep, then even if you had a little bit of amount of control, your identification performance is roughly constant, as long as you had some control. The zero control anyway is random, so that's an odd condition. However, when you did not catch the sheep, then performance increased as a function of control. Okay, so that means how you see yourself probably depends on different levels. Remember, we talked about hierarchy. So if you have a goal, you achieve the goal, how much control you have doesn't matter. Actually, as long as you manage to achieve goal, you probably feel the same way. Maybe by luck you made the shot, but you probably feel the same way whether it was luck or not. But the actual amount of control actually mattered at a lower level when you did not achieve the goal, in this case catch the sheep. Okay, so we did a second experiment, one to replicate, the other is to add some things, is what kind of errors, misidentification, that is here we are interested in that the fact that you actually identify the computer chase wolf by mistake. So we are interested in errors, by the way, in this particular experiment. We changed a couple of things. Let me just show it here. Now, remember there are multiple agents. You have one agent, you have another agent. Now the issue is that if, for example, you actually have no access to this information, this is somebody else, okay? But you can of course have information at the top level though. You can see whether they have achieved the goal or not. Assuming you have shared goals, you can at least observe them. So presumably you have some information about the other agents, but probably only at the top level, not at what is happening in these levels. But presumably you have information about all these levels. But the question is that what is going to happen? Your sense of agency then, if assuming you share this, and if your control is poor, then maybe you will actually misidentify more. So here is the experiment. We actually added another level of control in terms of what we just called it congruency. This is again in terms of the joystick and how you move the joystick and what kind of an effect it produces. Okay, so let me quickly jump to the results. Okay, so what happens is that they misidentify, but they misidentify with the computer. Now in this experiment, there was only one computer wolf and the one wolf you are controlling. So there are only two. So it was easy and it was balanced. So either you identify correctly or you misidentify as another chaser wolf. And what happened is that people misidentify the chasers more if the chaser is the winner. Okay? So when the chaser wolf won, or the computer control wolf won, they misidentified more. They thought it's me, that's me, the one that has reached the goal. Okay? In the low control condition, right, the pattern of misidentification is not influenced by congruency, but only when they misidentify with the winner. So the congruency mattered, but only if the control was low. Okay? So let me just conclude it. I think it's sufficient that we do think the kind of control that we have at different levels in a hierarchical system, probably the level, if you achieve a control at a particular level, then that's essentially would be your sense of self. That's the way you would say think about yourself or feel about yourself or whatever terminology you want to use. So if, of course, at a particular level you achieve control, then that's where you would think. If it's not possible, it will go down one level lower. So wherever level, remember though, there is some level in which you will achieve some amount of control. So you will always have some sense of self, whatever you are doing. Okay? And I think that's it. So hopefully this will help in trying to study something like self, which is relatively hard to study. Okay, thank you. Questions?
You identify the self with control over the environment. But there is also a inner self who might say that is the true self. So what would you say?
I never said control of the environment actually. The control here is in the perception action system or the loop. So in fact, to be precise, I am uncomfortable saying we control the environment or we even control actions.
So I don't mean that. I mean that supposing there is no perceptual action in the external sense, but there is only memory recall or...
No, this is perception action in all internal sense only. There is nothing external. The organism perceives, performs some action, so it's all internal.
So I mean, supposing that there is no external action performed or controlling a joystick or whatever, it is only recall of memory and...
Sure. Of course, that we can ask people to perform that, but we can't manipulate it or control it. So all we have done is something that we have to externalize in an empirical study so that we can study it. So one way of putting it, think that the joystick is inside your head. Okay? So if you want to interpret the results of the study, don't think the joystick is outside. It's a computational mechanism inside your head. Okay? So the one system is trying to control another system or influencing another system, whichever way you want to think about it.
So if you think this construction of the self happens in child or at a later stage, or does it happen in other organisms?
The way I have said it, it probably happens in amoeba also. It really doesn't matter. But remember though, the sense of we are claiming though that the sense of that you have, even over time, is not constant. It is not the same. So you may feel whatever, it keeps changing, depending on your interaction with the environment, as well as whatever mechanisms. So it's a bit of an interactionist view.